Hello and welcome to the second Kes English podcast. This week I'm joined on my right by Robert Maundrell and on my left by Nilay Sir.
Pleasure to be here.
Both members of Year 11, both today discussing their favourite poems of the anthology and why one is better than the other. Rob Maundrell is going to be talking about...
I'm going to be talking about exposure and looking at how it was written to deconstruct the Parliament's propaganda that was being sent out to the nation.
Gorgeous stuff. And Nilay Sir?
I'm looking at London and how it propounds this revolutionary idea about the social situations in London.
Fantastic. Right. So, Rob, I'm going to start with you.
Mm-hmm.
What's your initial argument as to why your poem is the best in the anthology?
Well, I think one of the fantastic things about exposure is how it's extraordinarily open to interpretation.
Right.
And whilst it is open to interpretation, there's still a rigid theme that remains throughout the poem. We're learning about the futility of war. We're learning about, as I've said, about the deconstruction of the propaganda, and we're also learning about how, whilst the people at home, the families may have been thinking that their soldiers were out there fighting on the front line, their relatives, in fact, they were sat there and nothing was happening.
Very interesting. Nilay?
For me, London within the anthology presents the ultimate depiction of powerless and social inequalities within the anthology. William Blake heightens his underlying didactic thrust of social reformation, antithetically actually, through his disconnected perspective and interesting use of non-critical tone. The reader in so is taken through an emotional journey, glancing at individual vignettes of suffering and plight. And in so, Blake stimulates the reader to gauge for themselves the preposterous propensity of institutionalized indifference.
Excellent stuff. Right, back over to Rob. You're talking about this open but rigid sort of idea. Do you have any points in the poem that particularly get this sort of thought across?
So, well, I think there's one subtle point that perhaps is easily missed, but is certainly present in the poem. As Nilay said about London and the narrative structure that's present there, there's also a narrative structure present in exposure. We're taken on a journey as a reader, and whilst we're starting in this hellish place with the merciless iced east winds that knife us, and then we've got the half rhyme, the para rhyme that Wilfred Owen uses when he finishes lines with silent and then salient. This is creating a sense of discomfort. The reader can feel the discomfort that the soldiers have. But having been in this place of hell, we are transported to a sort of heaven with the blossoms trickling where the blackbird fusses. We've got images of new life and hope. And there's sort of this lexical field of spring almost. It's complete change from where we've been. And then we are taken back down to hell. And this journey that we're taken on, it actually could very subtly represent the symptoms of hypothermia. There's this hallucinatory state that the Wilfred Owen is in, and his comrades are in as well. And as a reader, we are taken there to this pleasure before coming down and looking at death.
Very interesting indeed. So, back over to Nilay. You're talking about social inequalities. Again, same question to you. Any particular point in the poem that really drives this thought forward?
Definitely. I think we see this probably most explicitly in stanza 2, where London, where Blake says, "Mark in every face I meet, marks of weakness, marks of woe." He provides this heart-wrenching account of the social inequalities within London, and this is shown through the use of synecdoche, of describing the people as merely faces, not as humans, dehumanizing the subject. And for me, this objectifies everyone within London as one issue. There's a kind of totality within their plight and abject poverty that seems so universal throughout the poem.
Interesting. So, back over to Rob. Would you say that there's similar in similarly to the poem London, would you say that there's an aspect of dehumanisation in exposure?
There certainly is. We're losing a sense in exposure of unity.
Okay.
The soldiers in the war, and in fact the people at home through the propaganda, were being told of, and images were being painted of absolute unity and this patriotic sense that is lacking in exposure. We are exposing these images. They are complete fakes. I think whilst we've got this personification, there's a personification in exposure. We learn of the weather, which has been completely personified, tugging on the wire, and it adds this dimension to the weather that it has a more detailed self to it. We can see it is sort of out to get the soldiers. There's this war that is going on with the soldiers and the weather. And Dawn amassing her melancholy army. There's this feeling of this war between the weather as well as the Germans. And in fact, the Germans are the lesser threat.
Interesting. That's a very interesting point, actually. So, Nilay, would you say that there are also aspects of conflict in London? And if so, would you care to expand on such ideas?
Most definitely. I think this conflict originates through the Bloodtown Palace walls. It's this image of the social conditions that London is trying to kind of explore. The Bloodtown Palace walls is linking to in the 1780s probably, about the French Revolution and how the social conditions are perfect, ripe for breeding such a political state in the UK. But for me, probably the most interesting representation of this conflict is between the chimney sweeper's cry and the every blackening church appall. And this is where I think London comes into its prime. This is where it ultimately shows human powerlessness at its greatest rather than exposure. Because Blake takes us to political radicalism. He takes us to the ultimate disapproval of enlightenment, institutions, and everything society is constructed by. He attacks the very heart of London and human civilization.
That's, again, another very interesting point. So, we've looked a bit at the language, we've looked a bit at the themes of each poem. Would you care to expand upon the aspects of structure in the poem and how that ties into your belief that exposure or London is the best in the anthology?
What I think makes exposure so fantastic is its consistency. Throughout every aspect, there is this militaristic sense. There's not just a semantic field of the military. We are experiencing the stanzas. They are all 8 monotonous, routine stanzas. Now, what this represents in a subtle tone is the boredom that the soldiers experience, the repetition, the continuousness, and also we learn of the rigidity of the military. Everything is controlled, it's all regular, everyone's supposed to look the same. They're all presented in this way. So each stanza is being presented in this militaristic way. We have this consistency throughout, and we've also got repetition of but nothing happens.
Right.
We learn that throughout this whole journey he's taking us on, nothing is happening. Perhaps the only escape that the soldiers do get is in this heavenly state of confusion, and this confusion is evident in the use of anastrophe when, for God's invincible spring, our love is made afraid. Is said. The words are not sort of in the normal order. There's a mix-up of the clauses, and this is revealing the delirium through structure that the soldiers do experience. So I think that is, again, a very important structural point.
Interesting, very interesting. Okay, Nilay, would you care to expand on structure in your poem?
Yeah, I think it's really interesting what Rob said about consistency and rigidity. To some extent, Blake does use that technique, but he takes it on a much deeper level for me. Blake starts by talking about, I wander through each charted street. There's this lexical disconnect between the narrative and the events he's describing. We see this almost bird's eye view. London below, the suffering, the marks. It's ambiguous. We can't quite see everything. But the structural pivot, the volta for me, is at the end of the second stanzaic division, I hear, colon. And the use of caesura here is most important because it reveals this barrage of suffering and helplessness within London. We now see the chimney sweepers cry. We now see and hear the sighs. We see the blood. We hear the curses, the tears. Everything is around us within this aural dimension. And Blake unlocks this through the use of this caesura. And it's most poignant because it shows, A, the widespread totality of helplessness and suffering, but also these individual pockets of helplessness.
Gorgeous stuff. Right, so to bring this to a close, I'm going to ask you a question. First, starting with Rob. If you were to write about these two poems, what kind of comparisons would you make? You know, like where would you bring out these level 9 points?
Between London and Exposure,
yes.
I'd have to say, if we were looking at the themes are quite contrasting. So in London, we are an observer. We are simply spectating on the place. We're listening, we're looking, and in a sense, that in itself is deconstructing one of the greatest cities in the world. London is painted as this beautiful place, this city of power and success. Exposure, we have the wars being painted. There's this feeling of patriotic, this feeling of camaraderie, and that is not present. So both of them are, in a sense, exposing lies that are present and revealing to the reader what reality is like. Again, yeah, that's the structure. We've already explored the rigidity, all of that, but I'd definitely include all of that to try and argue some really strong points about the two poems.
Gorgeous stuff. And finally, Nilay, I'll bounce the question back over to you. Let's hear some level 9 points. Let's hear some comparisons.
For me, they both ultimately depict the futility of human power. They both show inequality, whether it's in war or whether it's in an urban environment. But what makes this so clear is the contrasting use of senses. So in Exposure, we feel, we see the weather battering against the soldiers. But in London, we hear, and that's shown in the third stanza, where each individual sentence starts with a letter to make hear, H-E-A-R. And so, ultimately, the use of senses binds these two poems together to ultimately form a horrible depiction of human suffering.
Fascinating stuff. There we go. That was a good one, I think.
Thanks, Freddie. You've been a great host.
Thank you for being here, and same time next week.